Well, a group of journalists are fighting to challenge the wiretap law, and they're taking that battle to the Supreme Court. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to allow the media and other parties to challenge FISA. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The law allows the government to monitor international communications, even if the person on one end is in the United States. The reporters say parts of this law strain their relationship with sources. To discuss, Greg P. Leslie, Legal Defense Director for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, joins me now. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
So kind of break it down for us here. What exactly is this new effort? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, let me first say that this is really the ACLU's case, and they've got a number of plaintiffs involved, including Amnesty International and some journalists. And then we came in as a friend of the court. We just wanted to give the court more information about why journalists need to be able to maintain confidential communications internationally. The more you're covering foreign affairs or terrorism-related subjects, the more likely you are to have to do it by phone over international calls. And the FISA amendments, not the original FISA Act, but the FISA amendments of 2008, make it much easier for the government to intercept those calls. And journalists just don't feel comfortable that they can promise confidentiality in that situation.
And why did you think it was important to step in and back the journalists?
Well, because it was a general, it was an attempt to challenge the law by a number of people who felt they were affected by it. And they had journalists involved, but we like to weigh in to talk about kind of the broad public policy arguments about how it affects journalism and what journalism needs under the First Amendment to thrive and to keep the government accountable, frankly.
Let's say you don't win, the journalists don't win, and their fellow plaintiffs. What effect could that have on journalists being able to carry out their jobs?
Well, I think it's just another step backwards in the ability of journalists to be able to make confidential promises of confidentiality to important sources. Anyone who's involved in international efforts can be suspected of being a terrorist or of aiding terrorism, or sometimes journalists legitimately need to interview actual terrorists or terrorist groups just to know what's going on somewhere.
Right, and whoever is on the other end would have, under this law, would have no guarantee that they're not being wiretapped, essentially?
Right.
Interesting. So FISA was recently renewed by Congress for another 5 years. It enjoyed bipartisan support. Proponents of it say that it's necessary to fight terror. So with that in mind, how optimistic are you that this is going to be able to move forward in your favor?
It's the Second Circuit Court of Appeals has said that the journalists do have standing to go forward with this case. That not just the journalists, but everybody in the ACLU's case has standing. And that's the critical threshold. You have to be harmed by the statute to show that you have a right to go to court to fight it. And so if that's upheld, the case just goes forward, and we don't know what comes next. But FISA is a very broad law that covers a lot of things, and a lot of those are absolutely necessary to fighting terrorism. But when Congress just broadly enacts something like this, which, originally FISA created FISA courts where judges approved these kinds of wiretaps, and then the amendments took it further than that. For certain kind of calls, international calls, even that involve U.S. citizens, you don't even need to go to the FISA court. So they took it one step further, and they didn't kind of account for the First Amendment rights. So it's very possible that a court could say that Congress went too far, just in this one little aspect. So nobody's asking them to turn over the entire FISA Act.
Okay, and going along with this, despite technological advances, journalism, a big part of it is your sources. I mean, developing and nurturing these relationships with your sources, and your sources need to trust you, otherwise they're not going to give you any information. So, I mean, something like FISA and crackdown similar to this, is this kind of cracking down on leakers? Do you think that that's what it's trying to achieve, or is this just an unintended effect of it?
Congress is also trying to crack down on leakers, but that's a separate action. So yes, that's also going on. They all do fit together. This is part of the congressional plan for fighting terrorism. They just don't, by nature, want to balance First Amendment rights as much as they should. They're doing important work, but they're not considering the First Amendment rights sufficiently.
Okay, I want to bring up also, because we've been following another story very closely. It involves journalists as plaintiffs taking the government to court. Well, we're talking about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Chris Hedges and other journalists and activists suing the government to take out a provision because they feel that it's blocking journalists from being able to do their jobs because they have to interact with terrorists, and they fear that they can be indefinitely detained if they're found to be communicating with terrorists. They did enjoy some success, but they did also face a lot of opposition from the White House. Do you fear that you could face the same opposition? And if so, I mean, how far are you willing to go in this fight?
Well, there's always going to be opposition, and the opponents are always going to say, if you're saying this law goes too far, that means you don't really want to fight terrorism. And so we always say it's always a matter of balancing. Of course, there are legitimate interests in fighting terrorism, but you've just got to balance. You've got to carefully develop laws so they account for competing interests. And, you know, again, we're a friend of the court in this brief, so we don't choose how far the litigation goes, but I'm confident the ACLU will take it as far as they can.
All right, very interesting, and thank you so much for coming into the studio. That was Greg P. Leslie, Legal Defense Director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press.